Hi guys, my name is Tom and I'm the Tech Chap, and welcome to my best budget phone comparison video. So I'm testing three of the latest and greatest budget smartphones. We've got the Motorola Moto E, the Sony E3 and the Nokia 635. Importantly, they all cost around £100 or $150, give or take a couple of quid. So at about a fifth the price of their flagship brothers, these phones represent excellent value for money. But the question is, which one's best? Which one is the best budget smartphone? Before we begin properly, it's worth noting that you can actually get variants of all three of these phones for slightly less money, the non-4G versions. But for this review and for these tests, I wanted to buy the unlocked SIM-free models, and I found it a little bit more difficult to get the unlocked models of the 3G, the non-4G versions. But if you are looking to save a few more quid, they are about £20 or $30 cheaper than these models. So if you're not interested in 4G, it's worth a look at those. For example, this is a Nokia 635. The Nokia 630 is pretty much an identical phone, just without 4G. And there's the same for these two models as well. So if you're not interested in 4G, have a look at those. But these are all 4G, these are all on the same level playing field, and they're all about 100 quid or 150 bucks. The Moto E is currently running on Android 5.0.2, the Sony E3 is running Android 4.4.4, and the Nokia 635 is running Windows 8.1. So they're all pretty up to date, some more so than others, and that may make an impact in other areas such as performance and user experience, but we'll find out in the full review. So I'll be looking at 5 different categories, putting these head to head. First we'll look at design, second the screen and sound quality, third the performance and storage, fourth the camera quality, and fifth battery life. And we'll look at a winner of each category and hopefully find an overall winner at the end. So let's get straight to it and look at the design of these three phones. So we have two Android phones and one Windows phone, each offering a similar design, although a bit chunkier and a bit cheaper feeling to their bigger brothers, the expensive flagship models. Now all these three phones offer the same 4.5-inch screen size. They all have expandable memory in the form of an micro SD card. And so, in my opinion, since they all cost about the same, they're on pretty much the same playing field, and so it will be a good comparison to see which is best. Now let me preface this comparison of the design aspect of the phones by saying that, of course, design, looks and feel are very subjective. You may completely disagree with my descriptions, but I'm just going to give you my honest personal opinion. I'm not looking at how they compared to the phones that sort of cost 5 times this much, just simply which is the best out of these three in front of me. So having used and held all three, my first impressions are pretty straightforward. I really like the Moto E. It's pretty chunky at 12.5mm thick and weighing 145 grams, but it feels rugged, and the thin bezels and soft textured sides give it both a sturdy, yet although not quite premium, higher end feel compared to the rest of the devices we have here. So I think, except for its thickness, it looks by quite some way the nicest and most upmarket phone of the three. And interestingly, unlike the Sony and the Nokia, you actually access the SIM and micro SD port by removing the plastic edging as opposed to popping off at the back. So if I can show you here, it's a little fiddly, but if I can get, I think there's a point at the bottom. Yes, I believe here. Nope, yep, I might try. Oh yeah, here we are. There's a little point here if you get your fingernail in, and you can pull it off the back. So it's this is the first phone I've seen that does this, but you pull the sides off essentially, which exposes the SIM card and micro SD ports. So that's pretty interesting, but it doesn't obviously really have any impact compared to just removing the normal back cover that we do on these two phones. But it's just a bit of a different design, I suppose. So I really like the Moto E, but if we move on to the Sony E3, which is the thinnest device we have on test here, at just 8.5mm thick, and although it's almost as heavy as the Moto E, weighing 144 grams, it's only a gram less, it feels very rubbery and not particularly nice. It's very easy to grip and hold thanks to its thick edges. Its corners are a bit less rounded than the Moto E's, and so isn't quite as comfortable in the hand. You'll feel it digging into your palm a little bit. So it's a little bit less comfortable to hold, but although the Sony is the thinnest, as I say, thanks to its pretty hefty top and bottom bezels, It offers a poor screen-to-body ratio of just 58.6%. That's compared to 64.5% and 64.4% for the Nokia and Motorola respectively. So it's sort of an unnecessarily big device for its screen size. As I say, all these three phones have the same 4.5-inch screen size, but if you can see there that the Sony is a fair bit taller than the Moto, and even a fair bit taller than the Nokia, and so obviously there's no decent reason for that. These aren't stereo speakers, unfortunately. We only have one speaker here. So the bezel, poor screen-to-body ratio, does take away some points from the design of the Sony, and also just generally, it's not very premium at all. It feels cheap, although although it feels quite rugged and quite grippable. This rubbery plastic back and sort of flush volume buttons, which give absolutely no travel and very little feedback to what you're doing, feels pretty cheap. It feels pretty horrible, and in my opinion, just isn't very nice at all. And next to the Moto, you can tell that it's just not as nice in terms of design. Moving on finally to the Nokia 635. I keep doing this. I keep pressing the volume up button, volume up and down button instead of the power button. The power button is actually located beneath the volume button, if you can see that. So I keep pressing this one instead of this one, but it's a minor thing. I'm sure if you bought it, you get used to it. But on the whole, it's 9.2 millimeters thick and weighing 134 grams. It is the lightest device on test, but sits firmly between the others in terms of thickness. The rounded corners means it's fairly comfortable to hold, but the plastic back and edge is obviously quite cheap plastic. It's quite scratchy. It's pretty cheap sounding, pretty cheap feeling. Now the back and the edge is just one removable bit of plastic. We can take this back off, which I will a bit later, as you could also with the Sony. But it's by far the cheapest in terms of feel and general design, in my opinion, out of the three phones I have here. And actually feels a fair bit bigger and a fair bit chunkier in the hand than even the Moto E, which is a fair bit thicker. So that's just down to the fact that it's sort of more brick shape, I think. Perhaps I could say it doesn't taper as much towards the back. It's a solid sort of bit of kit. So it's not quite as ergonomic. It's not quite as comfortable to hold, and it definitely feels cheap. So let's move on to the screen and sound category. All three devices offer a 4.5-inch IPS LCD display. The Sony and the Nokia offer a resolution of 854 by 480, affording them a pixel density of 218 ppi, whereas the Moto boasts a slightly sharper 960 by 540 res, which gives it 245 pixels per inch. It's a minor difference, but it means the Moto is a little bit sharper, is a touch more crisp, thanks to that slightly higher resolution. Unfortunately, none of the screens are perfect, and one way of demonstrating the screen uniformity over all these three devices is I'm just going to play a simple film. That film is Groundhog Day, which is a great film, and I appreciate it isn't the most recent or the highest quality, but what it will do is give us a chance to look at the viewing angles, the color, reproduction, and the sharpness. So if I jump into the video apps for each of these. Now the display that stands out immediately for me is the Moto E. It's sharp, it's clear, the colors appear quite natural, and it's just sort of rich and detailed. It's not too punchy, it's not undersaturated, and so immediately the Moto E does look a bit better. The Nokia has by far the worst viewing angles. If we compare the two, you can see that the Nokia becomes a lot less bright, and you cannot really make out the image at even quite a fairly obtuse angle. So the Nokia has the worst viewing angles. The Sony offers a decent display, but there's an unmistakable blue tint to the color temperature of the device. It may not come across quite so obviously in this video, but in reality it's quite clear that the Sony is just a bit undersaturated, has a bit of a cool tint, a bit of a cool cold color temperature, and it's not quite as nice to watch. It's less vibrant and less punchy as a result. So immediately looking at this, the Moto stands out as being the best. Now another slight issue is that although the Nokia has quite a warm picture, it sort of goes the opposite way of the Sony, offering a slightly oversaturated, slightly too warm color. The issue here is that, as you can see, the software buttons don't go away. On higher-end phones, I looked it up on the Nokia 735, for example, and higher. There is an option within the settings to hide these with a swipe. But on this model, I've checked, and this is running the latest 8.1 software, there is simply no way of getting rid or minimizing or hiding these icons here. So even in full screen sort of YouTube, full screen Netflix, full screen movies, or in apps, it doesn't go away. So unlike the Android devices where you can swipe in to show them again, and then it sort of goes away after a few seconds, giving you the full screen to appreciate your content, the Nokia just stays there. And not only does that take up part of the relatively small screen, but it's quite distracting as well. I mean, depending on what situation you're watching this, it could be quite bright, and it just takes away from the experience a bit. So although I would rate the Moto E as having the best display, and I would say the Nokia Lumia probably comes second in terms of display quality, I prefer a slightly warmer hue than I do the very cool tint of the Sony. But unfortunately, due to this really annoying issue with these software buttons, I think the Sony and Nokia will have to be tied. As I say, the Nokia image quality is a touch nicer, a little bit sharper, a little bit warmer, but it does take away points when I can't get rid of this bloody software bar here. So it's another win for the Moto in terms of display quality. In terms of brightness, though, the Sony does beat the rest here, offering an impressive 566 nits. That's a lot more than the Nokia's 540 and Moto's 393. So significantly brighter, the Sony, and if that's important to you, if you use your phone outside a lot in bright daylight, then that may be something that's important to you. But tied for screen quality, but the Moto, I think, takes this one. Now moving on to the sound and call quality, the Moto E features a single speaker on the top on the front bezel. It produces reasonably detailed sounds, and it's quite warm and quite pleasant, and one of the best on test.
Phil Connors, I thought that was you. How you doing? Thanks for watching. Hey, now don't you tell me you
It's a great film. So the speaker's pretty good there, quite rich. I would happily enjoy watching the rest of the film on that with that speaker. The Sony E3, although actually has cutouts for what appear to be speakers on the top and bottom, as they are in the higher end phones like the Xperia Z2 and 3 flagships, actually is only one speaker on the back, just beneath the Xperia logo here. So that produces actually the worst sound on test. It's quite tinny. And doesn't get particularly loud either. So the combination of quite a blue tinted screen and the worst sound quality of the three, it's not a good start for the Sony. The Nokia also produces a good sound like the Moto, but actually is quite a lot louder. It can go quite a lot, the volume can go quite a bit higher, definitely so, as you can see. So the Nokia wins in terms of loudness. The Moto probably is equally good in terms of quality, but and the Sony is a definite third here. So Moto and Nokia up there, but thanks to its extra volume, the Nokia probably takes the lead in terms of sound quality. And now in terms of call quality, it's a similar story, but the Moto E has a slight edge in clarity, possibly due to its slightly larger speaker. All devices were perfectly adequate, but the Moto E produced a notably clearer sound for me. I was clearly understood by the person I was talking to on all three phones. There didn't appear to be any major differences there, so for call quality, they're all pretty good, but the Moto, for my own personal sound, for hearing the person I'm talking to, just takes a little bit, so it takes the lead there. So in terms of screen quality, again, the Moto beats the competition. The Sony is a little bit cool, the Nokia is a little bit warm, and although the Sony has the worst viewing angles of the three devices, I really am a little bit sort of annoyed by the Nokia software buttons you can't hide or dismiss. They're always there no matter what full screen content you're watching. So the Moto clearly takes the lead in screen quality, and the Sony and Nokia are probably tied for second place in this category. In In terms of performance, all three phones are fairly similarly spec'd, but it is worth noting that the Moto E is a fair bit newer than these two. This came out in February 2015, that's compared to September 2014 and April 2014. So it's got a good 6 to 10 months on these two devices, and so it's not unreasonable that it's got slightly better hardware. But that's not really the Moto's fault. If Sony or Nokia had updated their phones, had released newer phones, I would of course test them against the Moto. So the Moto probably is at a slight advantage here because it does have a slightly more powerful processor, but that's not really its fault, and therefore if it wins this category, then so be it. You don't care when it came out, you want the latest and greatest. So let's find out in detail what the performance and storage of these three devices are. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty of performance. The Nokia 635 and Sony E3 both offer a 32-bit Qualcomm Snapdragon 400 chip, which features an Adreno 305 graphics processor alongside 1 GB of RAM. The Moto E boasts a 64-bit quad-core Snapdragon 410, which has an Adreno 306 graphics processor, also alongside 1 GB of RAM. So specs are always pretty complicated, so it'll be obviously interesting to see how these fare in actual use. But to start, I ran a benchmark, which should show us how fast the phones are. It's the Antutu benchmark, and to save time, rather than running it now, I ran it earlier and took a screenshot. So if I go to my images on all three devices, if you bear with me. There was a slight issue with the Moto E in running the benchmark in that it never actually wanted to display the score here. It would run fine and it would give me a score, but it doesn't actually produce the number that I was looking for in this little circle thing like it does on the Sony. But it does in this other screen on the benchmark. So the Moto E3, this is the second gen, scores just over 23,000 points. The Moto E scores just over 18,000 points. And the Nokia scores in it's the same app but slightly different. This is on the Windows Store, and so the app isn't identical. The layout's a bit different, but the Nokia 635 scores just under 12,000. If you're interested in how I took these screenshots, obviously it's a bit different for each phone. On the Windows Nokia 635, if you hold the power button and the volume up, you take a screenshot. On the Sony phone, it's power button and volume down, like so, and that's the same on the Moto. It's power button and volume down. So the scores are pretty interesting. In this one synthetic benchmark, the Moto E is the clear winner, but don't pay too close attention to the Nokia results, as although it is the same benchmark, the app is different and reacts differently thanks to its different Windows Phone operating system as opposed to the two Android phones here. So since the Nokia and the Sony have the same hardware, the same Snapdragon 400 and same 1 gig of RAM, for the sake of removing the operating system variable, I'm just going to compare the Sony and the Moto. So we're sort of pitching Snapdragon 400 versus 410 here. And we find in this comparing these numbers that the Moto is about 23% faster than the Sony. So does this translate into better real-world performance? Well, let's find out by doing a quick app launching speed test on all three devices. So let's start having a look at the speed with a quick browser test. Now these two, I have Google Chrome on, and this has Internet Explorer. And actually I can't even find in the Windows Phone Store, I may be wrong, but I can't find a Google Chrome app in there. So we're going to have to stick with Internet Explorer, and maybe that's fine, maybe it does work a bit better with the Windows Phone operating system anyway. So if we open up the three browsers, the Moto loaded a little bit quicker there, but these are all different sites. So let's jump into the same site. If I go to my website, we've got the Tech Chap ready to load there. So it's going to be a little tricky to press all these three at once, but I'll give it a go. Let's try, how is it going to go? Let's try it like this. There we go, I got it. So the Moto and the Nokia did perform the best there. The Sony was a little bit slower, I think. But let's move on from that to have a look at loading some other apps. So if we start next with the, what should we go for? Let's go for the Twitter app next. These two and that one. So 3, 2, 1, go. Moto, Sony, Nokia. So quite a bit behind here, the Nokia, the Moto 1 and the Sony was just behind it. So that sort of is what we'd be sort of looking to expect. It's sort of about 10 to 20% faster. Now let's try loading. What else do we have here? Let's go into a quick game. I know it's old, but let's play with Doodle Jump. If I bring this over there so it's easier to press. This is quite hard, pressing 3 things at once. Now, none of these apps have been loaded before. This is a fresh restart of the phones before I start this review. So if I go to the 3 here, 3, 2, 1. Interestingly, the Motorola came last there. The Nokia won that one, so it's not exactly clear cut just yet. Let's try the Netflix app. If we these two and this one, I've logged in already and disabled the notifications, so we should just jump straight into the app. 3, 2, 1, go. So pretty close between the Moto and the Sony. The Moto did just take the lead there at the end, and as you can see, the Nokia is quite a way behind. So I think we can see the impact perhaps of the Windows Phone software here. It's not maybe quite as fast, although it's nice and smooth to use. The Windows Phone, as I'm sure many of you have already tried, it's quite impressive how Windows does run very smoothly and very well on even the lowest end hardware. But we can see that either these apps were just a bit more optimized for Android or there's something else, but these two are loading a little bit quicker, and the Moto, I think, is taking the lead generally. So there's just a little app comparison. It's not quite clear cut. There's not a big difference in the performance, but I suppose if you do want the fastest for the budget, you're going to be opting again for the Moto E. Now, in terms of storage, it's a little bit of a different story. Both the Nokia and the Motorola have 8 GB of inbuilt storage, whereas the Sony only has 4. And what's even worse is that actually you only get about 1.7 GB to play with. If I jump into storage in the settings here, you can see the total space, which is just ridiculous, is 1.72 GB available, and I've only got about just under 500 available to me. So that's pretty awful in terms of storage, and thankfully the Moto and the Nokia double it to 8. It's still not a lot, but fortunately all 3 do offer expandable storage in the form of micro SD ports found inside the back covers, or in the case of the Moto, on the side. So you can put an SD card in all 3 devices, but only up to a maximum of 32 gigs in the Sony and the Moto, whereas you can actually put one up to 128 gigabytes in the Nokia. So the Moto and the Nokia definitely are in front of the Sony here with its pretty rubbish 4 gigs of internal storage, but the Nokia is just ahead of the Moto since it supports a larger capacity micro SD card. So now we're on our 4th category, and this is going to be about camera quality, and this is where the 3 phones diverge a bit more significantly, and it's a little bit more interesting how these come out and how these fare compared with each other. Now, all 3 phones offer a 5 megapixel rear camera. Only the Sony and the Moto offer a front-facing camera, although these are only 0.3 megapixel VGA cameras, so they're not very good, but we'll have a look at them later. But the Sony is actually the only phone to offer a flash, a rear flash. The other 2 don't have anything, so that's definitely a feature worth looking at, and a plus for the Sony. And also another plus for the Sony is it's the only phone that can shoot full HD 1080p, whereas the Nokia and the Moto are limited to the slightly lower 720p HD. So enough about the specs. What takes a better picture? Well, let's have a look. If we start with the Chap mug image, the Nokia has a slight green tone visible on the white tiles and noticeable compared to the Sony picture. The Sony retains the most detail throughout, especially in the shadow of the mug against the tiles, where it's not only lighter but more detailed and less noisy. So for the mug pick, the Sony is the nicest, with the Nokia in 3rd place. Moving on to the DSLR picture, the Sony is the only phone to feature a flash, which was set to auto in the scene, and it decided it did want to use it. So although the flash is pretty harsh, it does naturally highlight a lot more of the image, particularly the DSLR lens, which is almost totally obscured in the other 2 images. So the Moto, although dark, offers nice colours and good amount of detail. The Nokia looks dull and lacks in detail. A solid win though for the Sony thanks to its flash, but credit to the Moto for a good image. Nokia definitely trailing here though. Onto the picture of the Nexus 6 phone. This picture highlights just how different the cameras really are. The Nokia offers a cool bluish color temperature, whereas the Moto goes too far the other way and oversaturates the color, producing an unnatural warmness. Again then, the Sony stands out with its natural color reproduction, although the image doesn't appear quite as sharp as the other two. Still, I think the Sony takes this one. So if we move on to the picture of the bush, first impressions are that the Moto is again slightly oversaturated. The berries are a bit too red, but looking at the leaves, it's a lot more detailed than the other pictures. The Nokia again produces an undersaturated bluish image that, although retaining a decent amount of quality and detail, is pretty dull. The Sony produces the most natural colors, but I'm seeing a trend in terms of lacking, in terms of its lacking in sharpness and detail compared to the Moto. So it's a bit of a Sony Moto tie for the picture of the bush, I think. The final pick I'm going to talk about for the rear camera is of the Chap cat. If any of you have seen my videos before, you may recognize her. Surprisingly here, the Nokia produces the pretty much the nicest image with good detail and nice colors. The Sony is the worst here. Surprisingly, the whites on her neck are blown out. The back of her chair is a bit too dark and it's lacking in detail. The Moto looks a touch too sharp, I suspect thanks to overprocessing of the image from the software, but it offers the lightest picture, good detail, and the whites and the background are the least blown out of the three. So for the cat picture, the Nokia nearly takes it, but the whites and the detail overall, I think the Moto just about takes the win there. So the Moto is the best for the picture of the cat. Now onto the front camera. Only the Sony and the Moto can take part in this one because the Nokia doesn't have one. Both produce, though, a fairly rubbish picture, but the Moto is clearly the superior out of the two. The Sony has very little detail, it almost seems out of focus, despite my best efforts to focus it. So as much as I wouldn't recommend using the selfie cam on either of these phones, the Moto is a fair bit better. As for video, the Sony should win this since it's the only phone to offer full HD video recording. That's 1080p versus the 720p on the other two devices. But if we play all three, it becomes pretty clear quite quickly that the Moto E actually does produce the best video. The Sony's is incredibly shaky and the color temperature is far too warm. The Nokia does a decent job offering good detail, but there is a noticeable cool bluey purpley tint to it, maybe a touch of chromatic aberration. In first place though, the Moto, it's smooth, offers nice detail, colors are natural, and quite simply blows the Sony out of the water. The Nokia comes in a respectable second place, I think, for video. So the camera test was pretty interesting, and all three phones traded blows in different areas. The Sony came up top in terms of just consistent image quality for still pictures using the rear camera. The Moto was the best for front camera and also for video recording with the back camera. Again, the Sony was pretty good because it had the flash. It's the only one with a flash. The Nokia throughout wasn't so good. It sort of trailed these two other devices in most areas. So it's pretty much between the Sony and the Moto. You're gonna have to weigh up whether you want best image quality or best video quality. That sort of is the toss-up to be made here. So that's up to you, of course. You can't really go wrong with either. They're both solid phones, and only when you're comparing them side by side will you notice slightly different color reproduction, slightly different detail and quality. I think I'd probably have to just about give this to the Sony. It takes a better picture, I think, and more consistently so. Although, as I say, it is very poor when it came to video quality. It was incredibly shaky. So that's a shame that it lets us down there, despite the fact that it does shoot 1080p full HD. So that was pretty interesting, but let's move on to the battery life. So on to the final category, battery life. Normally I would start by running an app, maybe like the Geekbench benchmark, to test battery life, but unfortunately in the case of the Windows Phone, it isn't actually on the Windows Phone store, which was an issue that actually has cropped up one too many times throughout my testing. Apps just aren't available on the Windows Store, which I'm commonly using on my Android phones. But instead I went with a good old-fashioned battery rundown test. So as you do, as I'm sure all the big tech reviewer companies and journalists do, I played Groundhog Day. It's just so happened to be the film that I put on earlier to test the displays and viewing angles, so I thought, well, let's run the film, which is an hour and 41 minutes long, on all three phones, while all three phones start with 100% battery, and see which one has the most at the end of the film. So all three devices had mobile data and Wi-Fi enabled, because I think most people do have those enabled, but NFC and Bluetooth disabled. And brightness was set to maximum, but auto brightness was also enabled. So fairly common settings there, but it doesn't really matter. What it does matter is sort of the relative difference in the overall results. So, but before I give you the results, it's just a bit of a sort of disclaimer, the fact that different people use their phones in different ways, so it's difficult to get a definitive real-world result for the battery life that you may get in the way you use your phone. But you can just use these results as a general indicator of battery performance. So with all three phones fully charged, I set Groundhog Day running, and at the end of an hour and 41, I looked at which one had the most battery life left, and it was a clear winner. The Moto E finished with 80% battery remaining, which was very impressive, and gives some of the flagship phones a good run for its money. So the Moto E is a clear winner. The Sony comes in second with in terms of how long it has left, with 72% remaining, so 8% behind the Moto. And the Nokia comes in third with just 62% battery left after the test. Now that does support what the specs on paper. The Moto and Sony have considerably bigger batteries, 2330 milliamps and 2390 milliamps, as opposed to the Nokia's much smaller 1830 milliamps. So it's a smaller battery and has therefore actually performed worse as well. So that sort of makes sense. But it's not quite the end there, because the Nokia is the only phone to feature a removable battery. If I can get my nails in here, you can actually hot swap out this battery. So if extended battery is important to you, if you can't get to a charger easily, then you can just buy another one of these for 10, 15, sort of 20 quid, 30 bucks, and keep it in your pocket, keep it in your bag, and hot swap it out to double the battery life essentially. So that's a feature unique to this phone out of the three, and I think is pretty important. So what I'm going to say is, and you may disagree, that the Moto wins in terms of battery life. It did have a solid 80% left, so that comes first. The Sony, although it had 72% left, I think the Nokia may just be a bit better for battery life because of that removable battery feature. So obviously you may decide that the removable battery isn't important to you, and therefore it goes like this. But either way, the Moto pretty much is the clear winner. So in conclusion, it's really interesting just how capable these three phones are. It really does mean that value or budget is no longer a bad thing. It just means good value for money. But in most categories, the Moto E did stand out. It was better spec'd, it's got a nicer design in my opinion, the performance was a little bit better, the battery life was a little bit better, and the camera was very good, even though it did trade blows with the Sony, and perhaps the Sony was a touch better overall thanks to its flash and slightly better picture quality. But I can't fault the Moto E. These are all good phones though, for about £100, $150, all 4G, all offer expandable memory, and all very capable. If the software is something you're more interested in, then the Windows Phone perhaps is the best Windows option to go for. But between the Android phones, for me, the Moto E does take the cake. So if you're interested in buying the Moto E, I've put a link in my description to buy one. I'd highly recommend it. It's a very, very good phone, and I've really enjoyed using them. So this has been my comparison video of the best budget phone. I hope you've enjoyed it. For more, check out thetechchap.com, and thank you very much for watching, and please do subscribe so I can continue bringing you videos as often as possible. Thanks a lot guys, cheers.